Most people believe that working harder is the path to wealth. They are wrong, and the evidence has been visible for 3,000 years. King Solomon, the wealthiest ruler of the ancient world, never described his wealth as something he pursued. He described it as something he structured. The difference between those two words is the difference between a life of financial repetition and a life of quiet, compounding control. What you were taught about money was not a lie. It was simply incomplete in the most expensive way possible. If this challenge is something you have long accepted as true, stay until the end. Two men, same employer, same salary, same city. One of them, at the end of every month, is calculating what he can delay paying. The other, at the end of every month, is deciding where to place what remains. Neither of them earns more than the other, but only one of them is accumulating anything. If effort were the deciding factor, both outcomes would be identical. If income were the mechanism, both lives would mirror each other, but they do not. And the question worth sitting with, the question most people avoid because the answer disturbs them is this: what is the invisible difference? Not discipline in the motivational sense, not willpower, not ambition, something older, something structural, something that most people in this generation have never been taught to see. There is a belief embedded so deeply in modern thinking that it no longer feels like a belief, it feels like reality. It feels like physics. The belief is this: the more effort you apply toward money, the more of it you will have. Work more hours, earn more income, accumulate more wealth. It sounds reasonable. It is logical on the surface. And for most of history, it has been repeated so consistently that questioning it feels almost disrespectful to effort itself. But observe carefully what this belief produces in practice. A salaried worker earns a steady income for 11 consecutive years. He works diligently. He receives incremental increases. He applies effort, and yet, at year 11, his financial position has changed very little from year 1, not because he failed, not because he was dishonest or reckless, but because the structure underneath his income was never addressed. He earned, he spent. He restarted, earned, spent, restarted. What appears from the outside as a life of financial progress is, under examination, a very well-maintained cycle. Moving, but not advancing. Active, but not building. The appearance of progress, masking a quiet repetition. This is not a judgment. This is simply what happens when effort is applied without structural design underneath it. The income arrives and immediately begins moving outward, toward obligations, toward consumption, toward things that display the presence of money rather than preserve its function. And here is where the illusion becomes most dangerous. The visible evidence of spending the updated vehicle, the larger apartment, the consistent dining creates the perception of financial health. To the outside observer, this person is doing well. To the person themselves, the sensation of spending often feels like the reward that the effort deserved. But perception is not position, and the feeling of wealth is not wealth. What appears as progress is, in most cases, controlled repetition. 3,000 years ago, in a region where trade routes converged and the movement of goods defined political power, there was a ruler whose wealth was documented not in the language of conquest or inheritance, but in the language of design. His name was Solomon, and what is notable, what separates the historical record of Solomon from nearly every other account of ancient wealth, is that his financial dominance was not described through aggression or urgency. It was described through order. He established systems. He structured alliances that created consistent resource flow. He built storage before he built monuments. He understood that the accumulation of wealth required, above all, a framework that could hold it. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 21, verse 5, the principle is recorded with unusual simplicity. The plans of the diligent lead to profit, as surely as haste leads to poverty. Read that again slowly. Not the labor of the diligent, not the effort of the diligent, the plans of the diligent. Planning is structural. Planning is the act of organizing reality before it arrives. Planning removes the need to react, because the decision has already been made in advance. In haste, the opposite condition leads not to slower progress, but to poverty. Urgency, in this ancient framework, is not a neutral condition. It is an active force that moves in the wrong direction. Ancient wealth was built on order, not intensity, not speed, not the performance of effort. Order. This is where the first assumption must be broken. Most people believe that needing money more urgently should produce more of it, that the pressure of necessity sharpens focus, that desperation, properly channeled, becomes drive. This is incorrect. And the mechanism that explains why is not emotional, it is structural. When money is urgently needed, the decision-making framework collapses inward. Every choice is filtered through the pressure of the immediate need. A person in financial urgency cannot evaluate long-term opportunity clearly because the mind is occupied entirely with short-term survival. Every potential action is measured against one question: does this solve the problem now? What this produces, consistently, is a pattern of decisions that relieve pressure in the short term while compounding disadvantage in the long term. The sale of an asset at below value. The acceptance of unfavorable terms. The inability to wait for a better position. Urgency is not a motivator. Urgency is a tax on judgment. And here is the deeper structural reality. Money, as a mechanism, responds to stability. Capital moves toward entities, individuals, institutions, systems that demonstrate the capacity to hold and manage it. A person who signals desperation through their decisions, their terms, their speed, and their choices signals to every financial interaction that they cannot be trusted with patience. The more urgently money is needed, the less control exists. This is not a philosophical observation. Watch it operate in practice. The person who cannot afford to wait accepts the first offer. The person who cannot afford delay signs unfavorable agreements. The person living from obligation to obligation cannot capitalize on anything that requires time. Meanwhile, the person who has structured their financial life, who has removed urgency from their daily operating condition, makes decisions from a fundamentally different position. They can wait, they can decline, they can hold. And in every financial context, the capacity to wait is a form of leverage. This is the mechanism. It is not a theory. It is not a philosophy in the abstract sense. It is a repeatable structural pattern that has operated across every era of documented wealth, including the era of Solomon, including this one. It is called the law of inverse flow. The definition is precise. The less urgently you need money, the more consistently it moves toward you through structured control and disciplined allocation. Inverse, because the direction of wealth movement is opposite to what most people expect. They expect money to come toward effort. It does not. It moves toward structure. They expect money to respond to need. It does not. It responds to stability. They expect that pursuing money harder will close the gap. In most cases, it widens it, because pursuit signals dependency, and dependency removes the very leverage that attracts consistent financial movement. Wealth begins when pursuit is replaced by design, not the absence of effort, the replacement of reactive effort with intentional structure. This is a distinction that most people never encounter clearly, because the culture surrounding money is built almost entirely around the pursuit model. Work harder, earn more, chase the goal. These are the instructions that circulate everywhere. And they are not entirely wrong. Income must exist before structure can be applied. But income without structure is fuel without a container. It arrives, it burns, it disappears. The law of inverse flow does not begin with earning more. It begins with designing where what already arrives will go. Here is the identity shift that this mechanism requires, and it is not small. Most people identify as earners. The primary relationship they have with money is the relationship of acquisition. How much came in? How much more can come in? How to increase the amount that comes in. This identity is not wrong, but it is incomplete to the point of being structurally dangerous. Because while the earner is focused entirely on the inflow, the outflow is operating without design. Money arrives and immediately begins distributing itself according to whatever obligations, habits, and impulses exist in its path. There is no architecture, there is no predecision. There is only the arrival and the subsequent disappearance. The controller operates differently. The controller has made decisions about money before it arrives. The allocation is pre-structured. The categories are fixed. The flow is designed, not discovered after the fact. When income enters the system, it does not encounter an open field, it encounters a channel. And channels direct movement. This is not about deprivation. This is not about minimalism or sacrifice, as ends in themselves. It is about the fundamental act of designing a financial system that does not require constant reaction. The realization that sits at the center of this distinction is quiet but significant. You have not lacked income. You have lacked structure. For most people who feel financially strained, despite consistent earnings, the problem is not the amount. The problem is the absence of a pre-designed framework into which that amount flows. Without structure, even a substantial income will distribute itself into consumption and obligation, leaving very little that accumulates. With structure, even a modest income begins to accumulate slowly, quietly, consistently. There is something that operates underneath all of this, a deeper mechanism. A hidden layer that explains why structure alone is not sufficient. Why some people build budgets and systems and still find themselves losing ground. It has to do with a specific quality that disciplined financial families across generations have maintained, not as a strategy they adopted, but as a condition they protect. It is not visible in spreadsheets. It is not found in income statements. It is a positioning, a deliberate distance from a particular state of mind that changes how every financial decision is made, how every opportunity is evaluated, and how money itself moves in relation to the person who holds it. That layer will be examined fully. But before it is named, consider this as an observation to hold. The families who accumulate quietly across decades do not appear to be working harder than those who do not. They appear, from the outside, to be doing less, moving less, reacting less. What they are actually doing is something far more precise. And what they have removed from their financial lives is something most people add more of every time they feel behind. Sit with that for a moment. Control attracts what desperation repels. The hidden layer is the absence of urgency. Not urgency in the emotional sense, not anxiety or fear, though those are often symptoms. Urgency in the structural sense. The condition in which every financial decision is being made under the silent pressure of need. The condition in which money must arrive, and must arrive now, because the system underneath cannot function without it. Most people live in this condition so consistently that they no longer recognize it as a condition. It simply feels like life. It feels like the normal pressure of adult responsibility. And because it is shared by nearly everyone around them, it is never examined. But here is what urgency does to a financial life at the structural level. It removes optionality. When money must arrive by a specific date to meet a specific obligation, every decision between now and that date is constrained. The job cannot be left. The offer cannot be declined. The negotiation cannot be extended. The opportunity that requires patience cannot be held. Every lever of financial power, the ability to wait, to choose, to decline, to hold, is removed by the presence of urgency. And what fills that space instead is compliance. Compliance with terms that were not favorable. Compliance with timing that was not ideal. Compliance with conditions that a person in a different position would never have accepted. This is why money moves away from urgency, not because the universe is indifferent to need, but because urgency, structurally, places a person in the weakest possible position in every financial interaction they enter. Control attracts what desperation repels. The disciplined families who accumulate quietly across generations understand this. In their primary practice, the thing they protect most deliberately is not their income level, and not their investment portfolio. It is this condition of non-urgency, the deliberate removal of financial pressure from their operating state. They do not wait for pressure to arrive and then manage it. They design their financial lives so that pressure does not reach them in the first place. They do not react. They anticipate. Stability is not luck. It is pre-decided. Now observe how this operates in practical, structural terms. Take a salaried worker, not exceptional in income, not particularly advantaged in circumstance. He earns a consistent monthly amount. And for years, that amount has distributed itself across obligations, habits, and consumption in a pattern he has never formally examined. He begins by doing one thing only. He maps the outflow, not to judge it, not to eliminate it dramatically, simply to observe it. Where does the money go? Into what categories? At what intervals? With what consistency? What he discovers, almost immediately, is that a significant portion of his income moves in ways he did not consciously choose. Subscriptions he forgot, habits that became automated, social obligations that expanded quietly over time. Small recurring movements that individually seemed reasonable and collectively created a substantial drain. He does not eliminate everything. He assigns categories: fixed obligations, the non-negotiables; variable expenses, the chosen ones; and a third category, which he has never formally created before, the contained amount, the portion that does not move outward at all. The portion that simply holds. Not an investment yet, not a financial product. Simply a contained amount that is pre-decided before the income arrives, an amount that is structurally removed from the field of available spending before the spending decisions begin. When money has direction, it stops disappearing. This is not a complex system, it is a simple one. But simple and easy are not the same condition. Because what this requires, what makes it difficult for most people, is the act of pre-decision, deciding in advance, when there is no immediate pressure forcing the decision, how the money will move when it arrives. Most people make financial decisions in the moment the money is present. And in that moment, every desire, every obligation, every social influence is fully active. The decision is made in the worst possible environment for long-term thinking. The controller makes the decision before the money arrives, in a calm, structured moment with no immediate pressure. The decision is made once, and then it simply executes. What is pre-decided does not require willpower in the moment. It is already settled. Now, the second structural principle of the law of inverse flow must be addressed directly. Delayed consumption. This is perhaps the most misunderstood principle in the entire framework, because in the modern context, it is almost always framed as deprivation, as sacrifice, as the denial of what was earned. That framing is incorrect, and it misses the mechanism entirely. Delayed consumption is not about refusing reward. It is about the timing of visibility. When income increases, when earnings rise, when a bonus arrives, when a financial improvement occurs, the instinct for most people is to immediately make the improvement visible. The upgraded vehicle, the expanded living situation, the elevated social presentation, the external confirmation that the financial position has changed. This instinct is understandable. The improvement was earned. Why should it not be shown? But what this moment represents, structurally, is the most critical test of whether financial gravity is being built or spent. Because the moment of increased income is precisely the moment when the structured system must hold. When the contained amount must increase alongside the earnings, not merely maintain itself. When the improvement is channeled inward into the system, into the holding position, rather than expressed outward into consumption. What is delayed is not lost. It is multiplied in control. The individual who receives an income increase and expands their lifestyle immediately has traded a structural advantage for a visible one. They feel better, they look better, but their financial gravity, the system that creates non-urgency, has not grown. In some cases, it has weakened, because the new lifestyle now requires the new income to sustain itself. The pressure has returned in an upgraded form. The individual who receives an income increase, and contains most of it, who delays the visible expression of that improvement, has done something different. They have increased the mass of the system. They have added to the holding position. They have deepened the condition of known urgency. Their outward presentation may be unchanged. Their inward position has shifted significantly. The test of wealth is not earning. It is holding structure under pressure. Here is where the psychological rewire must occur, because without it, all of this remains technique. And technique without identity does not hold. The shift being described throughout this narration is not a shift in behavior. Behavior is downstream. The shift is in how a person relates to money at the level of identity. The earner defines himself through income. His financial confidence rises when money arrives and falls when it diminishes. His sense of stability is tied directly to what is coming in. And because income is, in most cases, outside his direct control, dependent on employers, markets, clients, circumstances, his financial identity is perpetually fragile. The controller defines himself through the system. His confidence is not attached to what arrives, but to the structure that exists underneath arrival. Whether income rises or contracts in a given period, the structure holds. The pre-decisions have already been made. The categories are fixed. The contained amount accumulates regardless of what the month felt like emotionally. This is what emotional detachment from income cycles means. Not indifference to money, not a spiritual rejection of financial concern, but the removal of the self-concept from the fluctuation of inflow. Wealth is the distance between you and urgency. When that distance is large, when the structure beneath your financial life is strong enough that urgency cannot reach you, in the short term, you make better decisions. You negotiate from a different position. You see opportunities that people under pressure cannot see. You hold leverage that people under pressure have already spent. This is the psychological rewire. Not motivation, not mindset. In the popular sense, a structural repositioning of the self in relation to money. From needing it to managing it, from pursuing it to designing toward it, from reacting to its arrival and departure to pre-deciding both. Movement without structure is disguised stagnation. Now, the daily ritual. It is simpler than most people expect. And it is not about tracking every transaction with obsessive detail. It is about one consistent, brief practice that maintains awareness. At the end of each day, not every week, not monthly, a brief examination. 5 minutes, perhaps 10. Not, how much did I earn today? That question looks at the inflow, which in most cases is fixed and beyond daily control. The question is, where did money move today? Into which category did each movement fall? Was it pre-decided or reactive? Did the contained amount hold? Did any movement occur that was outside the established structure? This is not an exercise in guilt. It is an exercise in awareness, because what is observed can be controlled, and what is not observed will distribute itself according to whatever impulses and obligations are present in the environment. The daily review is not a disciplinary act. It is a maintenance act, like checking that a structure is intact. Brief, calm, consistent. Most people examine their finances when something goes wrong, when a balance is lower than expected, when an obligation cannot be met, when a financial surprise disrupts the month. By that point, the examination is reactive. The decision has already been made. The awareness arrives after the movement. The daily review moves awareness ahead of the movement. Not dramatically, not with complexity, simply with the consistent act of observing where the system stands each day. What is observed can be controlled. Now, a calm warning. Because there is a temptation that will arrive, it always does, when this framework begins to operate, when the contained amount begins to grow, when the condition of non-urgency begins to establish itself, when the structure begins to demonstrate, quietly, that it works, the temptation is to accelerate, to deploy the contained amount prematurely, to introduce complexity into a system that is working through simplicity, to add activity because the stillness begins to feel insufficient. This is the moment at which most people who have built something quietly begin to dismantle it. Not through failure, through impatience. Time rewards structure, not speed. The ancient framework, the one embedded in the documents of Solomon's era, in the principles of Proverbs, in the recorded behavior of those who accumulated across generations, was never built on speed. It was built on patience and consistency applied over intervals that most modern thinking refuses to respect. Generational thinking is not slow thinking. It is thinking that operates in a different unit of time. Where most people calculate in months, the disciplined family calculates in years. Where most people plan for next season, the ancient framework planned for the next era. This does not mean inaction. It means structured action, deliberate, pre-decided, consistent, applied without the contamination of impatience. What is unseen is often the most stable. The man who accumulates quietly does not announce the system. He does not display the growing position. He does not seek validation from his environment for the choices he has made. He operates within a structure that is invisible to those around him. And that invisibility is not a cost, it is a feature. Because what is not displayed is not subject to the social pressure that demands performance. What is quiet accumulates without interference. Silence is a financial position. Return now to the two men introduced at the beginning. Same salary, same city, same employer. One of them, at the end of each month, is managing a reaction. The other is confirming that a pre-decision held. The difference between them is not income. It is not intelligence. It is not opportunity in the conventional sense. It is structure. It is the presence or absence of a designed framework into which income flows and from which urgency is removed. One of them needs money to arrive. The other has already decided what happens when it does. The law of inverse flow does not promise speed. It does not promise dramatic transformation in short intervals. It promises the one thing that most financial frameworks cannot offer: a fundamental shift in the direction that wealth moves. Away from urgency, toward structure, away from pursuit, toward design, away from noise, toward the quiet, controlled position from which every financial decision is made calmly, deliberately, and from a place that does not depend on the outcome. This is what Solomon understood. Not that wealth could be chased into submission, but that it could be structured into arrival. The plans of the diligent lead to profit, not the effort, not the urgency, not the speed. The plans, and the man who plans carefully, who designs the system before the money arrives, who removes urgency before it removes his judgment, who holds structure when income resizes and when it contracts, that man does not chase wealth. He simply creates the conditions under which wealth has no other direction to move. Money follows the man who has already mastered its absence. The law of inverse flow, structure creates what pursuit cannot. Share this with someone who earns but never accumulates.